Welcome to the Evolve, Move, Play podcast. I'm your host, Rafe Kelley. At Evolve, Move, Play, our aim is to help you cultivate a more meaningful life and a more heroic self by reconnecting deeply to movement, mindfulness, nature, and community practices. This podcast was created to bring the best and brightest minds in all of these subjects together to better understand how we can create an empowering and sustainable ecology of practices for personal growth. If you're interested in being part of this ongoing conversation, the best way you can support us and get involved is by joining our Podcast Plus membership. By joining, you will get backstage access to our live podcast airing once a month, as well as a private question and answer session with me and our guests after the show. On top of that, you'll get access to our thriving online community where you can continue these deeper discussions with people all over the world who are just as passionate and curious about these topics as you. More details about the membership, as well as the link to get signed up, are in the description below. And whether you can join, be sure to like, share, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so that you can be notified every Monday when our episodes drop. Thanks so much for your support, and we hope you enjoy the show. Hey guys, welcome back to the Evolve, Move, Play podcast. This week, my guest is Lucas Dimoveo. So you may not have heard of Lucas's name before. He doesn't keep a super high profile in kind of public spaces, but he's a really interesting thinker who is a long-term member of the parkour community. I remember watching Lucas move to Colorado and sleep on cardboard outside of a shed outside of a friend's apartment in order to try to make his parkour dreams come true. And ultimately, he didn't progress to a professional level in parkour, but he stayed really involved in the community and did develop a very high level of skill when he was practicing. But he's moved on to other things in his life. But he's also very passionate about social justice and transhumanism. And Lucas and I have had a number of debates over the years where we tend to see things from opposing perspectives. But unlike a lot of those discussions, we've always tended to be able to discuss things in a way that was really collegial. And Lucas reached out to me because he just wanted to be able to have a chat with me about these things on the podcast. And I was interested in that because I think a lot of his perspectives are shared by people in the parkour community. And I come from a very specific political perspective. I try not to get too political with these podcasts, but I thought it was important to feature somebody who wasn't in agreement with me on these topics and could articulate well some of the ideas from the other side. And we can interrogate these ideas because there are major things that are happening within the movement community and in the parkour community. And I think it's important for people who have differences of opinion about that to be able to engage in good faith dialogue. So this was a really fascinating conversation, really deep. Lucas and I ended up turning off the call and then talking for another hour about stuff that was, a little bit more touchy and even harder to get into. But we cover transhumanism. We cover, what is critical social justice? What are other approaches to social justice? What are some of his experiences around these things? Where does his perspective come from and how that is impacted by his own personal experience and his personality and where he came from? And I think it's a really deep and powerful and valuable conversation. Unfortunately, because it was so long, there's moments where Lucas had to get up to, and take a little break for a second. So we paused the recording and then put it back on. Unfortunately, the last time we paused the recording, we didn't we forgot to put it back on. So the conversation ends kind of abruptly, but hopefully we'll have Lucas on again and be able to finish some of these ideas. But I think you're going to enjoy this and get a lot out of it. Especially if you're interested in sort of these discussions around not just how do we move well, but how do we organize ourselves through good sense making and through the movement community to be able to bridge our gaps better and understand who we are and what's happening in our culture better. So without further ado, enjoy my conversation with Lucas Dimoveo. So Lucas, welcome on the Evolve, Move, Play podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So you reached out to me because you wanted to have a conversation, and I'm kind of interested in some of these conversations with people who are following the channel, but also I'd actually been interested in potentially having a conversation with you for quite a while. And the reason is because I'm a big critic of sort of what I call critical social justice approaches. Those are social justice that's from a critical theory perspective, what, it's more commonly called wokeness these days. And I've seen you as a defender of those in the community, but unlike a lot of people who defend that, I perceived you as generally being open-minded to trying to understand where people from the other side are coming from, and interested in good faith dialogue, which is something that, to be frank, I don't find a lot of people who come from that perspective seem to be oriented towards. So that was my interest in sort of being like, okay, this person disagrees with me on a lot of stuff, which is fine and interesting, but I think I could actually have a conversation with them. So tell me a little bit about why you wanted to have a conversation with me.
Yeah, so I think you're one of the few people that has a platform in the parkour community that talks about I would say values that asymptotically approach social conservatism. Like maybe you're not like on the graph itself, but sometimes you approach it, sometimes you have different opinions. And I think our viewpoints are so axiomatically different, but we're part of the same community. We both love parkour. We've been in the community for a while. You've been in the community for probably like 7 years longer than I have.
I started in 2005.
Yeah. Okay. Jesus. I started in 2010.
Okay. Yeah. There you go.
So, so it's kind of just like interest. I wanted to talk to someone who, we're basically in the same religion, but we believe very differently.
Yeah.
And I think there's also this kind of crisis with male identifying people in the parkour community that are beginning to age out of it. And there's this gravitation towards Jordan Peterson, these sort of like these right-wing narratives that can help anchor one's identity. And to me, it's a little worrying. I understand why that's the case. But it's a little worrying. So there's kind of like people who can handle adult life, 40 hours a week, that kind of thing. People who fall into deep depression, drugs, suicide, whatever. And then people who really just veer off to the like weirdo right-wing world. And so I'm trying to understand coping mechanisms for men as they age out of having parkour be the only factor in their life.
That's interesting. I mean, I wouldn't describe Jordan Peterson as particularly a right-wing figure from my perspective, but we can get into that. And I also see, I think, this crisis of masculinity within the parkour community. And I guess I see it sort of, I don't see a lot of extreme right-wing people in parkour at all. Right?
I should probably preface this by saying this is an English phenomenon, the right-wing bent that I've noticed, and not so much North American. And I don't know why that is.
I feel I want you to give me names because I can't think of an English guy I know who's strongly right wing, but I also don't want to be like accusing people on the podcast of being extremists.
So. I would like people to also be here, like so they can defend themselves.
I guess I don't recognize that, but yeah, that's interesting. I'm kind of in the opposite perspective where I feel like I've seen, one of the reasons why I want to talk to you is because I'm very worried about the influence. I guess you're worried about the influence of right-wing perspectives. I'm worried of the influence in general of extreme left-wing perspectives, you could say, or to be more precise, I think that critical theory inflected social justice narratives are being widely picked up within the community. Most people don't actually understand where they come from or what their origins are or what their implications are. And they're being replicated. And I see them tending to tear our communities apart, and also tending to, in my opinion, I see that people who adopt them tend to end up in pretty miserable psychological places. I see the people who adopt the Jordan Peterson perspective, on the other hand, moving towards a much more balanced and healthy life, right? And it's not always Jordan Peterson, but a lot, it's striking to me that like within the Seattle parkour community, there are the people who talk a lot about social justice. And then there are people who don't talk a lot, but the people who don't talk a lot, almost all, for instance, ended up getting interested in Jordan Peterson. Like I remember going to a Jordan Peterson event in 2017, I think. And like, as we were standing in line, like I saw like 5 guys who were like old mainstays of the parkour community, guys who've been around for a decade, who had no idea were interested in Jordan Peterson. And most of these people don't post their political opinions on social media at all. People do approach me and talk to me behind the scenes, right? Like, oh my God, this happened, right? So yeah, so that's what I'm seeing is that there's a lot of people who are not feeling safe to actually talk about what their beliefs are, perspectives are within the parkour community, because they're getting shouted down and getting accused of being racist and sexist and extreme right wingers. And there's a lot of people who, this is less true now, I think. It's hard to say, but like for a couple of years there, it really felt like there were people that I didn't want to train with in the community because every event would be politicized, right? You couldn't go to a jam and everyone would be cool. It was like you had to have a discussion of social justice, or somebody would transgress some social justice boundary, right, and would get yelled at, and it just felt like politics had invaded our community. Whereas when I first started training parkour 17 years ago, one of the things that was really cool was how it united people across the political spectrum, right? We'd have these intense debates with friends who are creationists and who are, hardline and extremist libertarians, or people who are anti-gay marriage at that point, or anti-drug legalization, which, I was on the other side of all those debates, but all those people were friends. Now, some of them, like one of those guys is now like the giant COVID skeptic who's telling us that like it's all the new world order and attacking everybody, and like I can't communicate with them at all anymore. But
so
my safe space from politics has become politicized.
Yeah, so I wonder how much of that is a generation gap, because when you started parkour, I was in high school. Mm-hmm. I was in middle school. Yeah. So there was an entire generation, not parkour generation, but like actual generation of children that aged into parkour.
Yeah.
And aged into the community. And so it might just be that there were different values that were brought into an adult, because you're an elder millennial, yeah, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I mean, technically, yeah. I'm an elder millennial. I'm 39.
Okay.
Like,
no fucking way.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're doing good for yourself.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I'm lucky. No, not balding and not graying early, so that helps. But yeah. I definitely have my parents basically were hippies, right? And so they were part of the 60s, 70s counterculture, and they were kind of, later in that generation, but they're baby boomers. And I was really isolated from the cultural currents of the 80s and 90s because I was in this kind of counterculture subcommunity. So I feel much more like a Gen X culturally, and I get on with Gen X people much better than with millennials. I share the Gen X perspective on millennials. I'm not a huge fan, but I mean, most of the students who came up with me, most of the people who are in the community, I mean, God, I think I think I can only think of one person who's like a big member of the community and has been in Seattle for a long period of time. He's a legit Gen X, right?
Okay.
Everybody else is younger than me, right? They were all millennials, and you know, a lot of them are about 8 to 10 years younger than me, and none of this stuff was current. None of this stuff was happening when the parkour community was starting up.
Yeah,
It all came
interesting.
in later. It was not a lot of the people who are propagating these memes, in my opinion, are people who have been around the community for a long time, right?
All right. Yeah. So I'm wrong. I'm wrong
Yeah,
on
yeah.
that.
I
I'm
mean,
not gonna.
well, we don't know. Like, let's not say you're wrong because
Well,
because
it
we're talking
was
about anecdotes, right? And
right,
I
right.
don't I haven't been super involved in the parkour community, so I don't know everybody who's involved, and I don't know how, like, it's possible that as the Gen Z and younger millennials have come into the community, that's been what those older millennials who I'm seeing are responding to. So it's still a plausible hypothesis. It's just, it doesn't accord with my experience, but my experience is only worth so much.
And as far as your personal experience, have you felt that there was a difference in communities across the states as far as kind of the prevalence of political? Because Seattle and Portland to me feel like very political cities. Like almost like sorry about the cars and stuff.
1 second. Yeah, I mean, I'll answer your question, which is to say, again, it's harder for me to say because my work has moved away from the parkour community directly, right? I still interact with the parkour community, but it's like I haven't been able to go to North American Parkour Championships since 2013. I haven't been able to go to any of the major jams. I haven't been to Winter Jam because I've just been busy with my own work, and I've been attracting a community that has, maybe it's 10%, 20% parkour athletes and people from movement culture and people from, various other places. So I'm not as deeply embedded in the community as I used to be. So I'm hesitant to say, but certainly, like, if you look at the broader social trends, like if you look at where people are getting canceled on campuses, it's almost entirely on the West Coast and the East Coast, right? It's elite universities in Massachusetts and New York and Connecticut and Oregon, Washington, especially, also San Francisco, Silicon Valley is huge for the kind of critical social justice perspective. Though my understanding of it is that it is essentially has total dominance of our educational institutions. The places where teachers go to be educated are all pretty much an ideological lockstep. So it is present in school systems throughout the country. It's just
so can I ask a few clarifying questions and then
kind
of clarify my own position?
Yeah. I'd love to. We've talked about my perspective. I'd love to hear from yours.
Yeah. So I haven't read any theory regarding critical social justice.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know anything about it, to be completely honest. What a lot of the perspectives of social justice that I know about is historical. So kind of the social justice movements of the 20th century, 19th and 18th century, especially the Quaker abolitionist movements.
Sure.
Especially in the UK, well, the British Empire. I don't know anything about critical race theory. I'm kind of interacting with the culture on the level of memes, so it's very, very surface level. And the arguments I had with people on social media. What do you mean when you say critical social justice?
Yeah, so I'm trying to draw a distinction between the perspective of someone like Robin DiAngelo or Ibram X. Kendi, or more specifically, someone like Angela Davis or Derek Bell or Bell Hooks, compared to someone like Martin Luther King, right? Martin Luther King is a person who is, very much working towards social justice, right? But he's actually specifically working within a Christian frame, right?
Right. Yes.
And if you've read Strength to Love, you know that King that he's essentially trying to realize what he views as a Christian vision of, the universal brotherhood of mankind.
Mm-hmm.
Critical social justice, in my opinion, is almost completely antithetical to the Kingian vision, which most people don't realize because it flies under the flag of anti-racism. But critical social justice descends from Marxism via, critical theory. And so my understanding of it is essentially, we can kind of track it back all the way to like Hegel, but so you have Marx, and then you have followers of Marx, and some of those became the Frankfurt School, right? Adorno and his students. And in particular, a really important figure is Herbert Marcuse. Right? Herbert Marcuse is a huge figure in left-wing thought in the 1960s. And his student, Angela Davis, is part of a specific commune of Black feminist thought that was radical ethno-Marxist, basically. Very much inspired also by Mao. And he basically says that in order to reach a sort of utopia, right, we have to get rid of all of the kind of current cultural structure. It's all installing this false consciousness in us, and we need this critical consciousness to allow us to progress to this new utopia that he imagines. Traditionally, Marxists, of course, believe in the proletariat, right? But Marcuse in the 1960s says that the working class is no longer the target of the left because they lack revolutionary consciousness. And instead, what we need is an alliance of intellectuals and people of color. And the idea is that because people of color suffer historical injustice, that they have
They're the proletariat.
Yeah, that they like the proletariat, but that they have a motivation to be contrary to the structure as it stands. Right? Mm-hmm. And so you have this alliance, which is pretty much the world it looks like we live in, between a relatively small segment of elite, affluent people and an activist base that largely exists within people of color communities or communities of color. I hate the term people of color. I think it's a bad construction, but within ethnic minority, visible minority communities. A lot of times the people in the activist base are promulgating ideas that have very little support within the communities that they claim to speak for. Mm-hmm. But they're helping direct political power into those communities. So they're given somewhat of a blind eye, right? Mm-hmm. So we can look at something like Black Lives Matter and how Black Lives Matter has a big emphasis on alliance with the trans community. If you look at polling,
which is not because the American Black community, most Black communities is very conservative.
Exactly, they're very socially conservative. Mm-hmm. So why is there not pushback from the African American community against something like Black Lives Matter, despite the fact that its ideology is actually completely contrary to their social ideology, because it's a power alliance?
Well, so
that's my view.
There is, but it seems like maybe we can talk maybe in a broader sense about social media conversations, but these conversations do happen, but they're happening between kind of the Black Baptists and Pentecostals and Hoteps and the social justice folks, but it's happening on Black Twitter, away from the eyes of the community at large. And then maybe you might see a meme or something. It gets misunderstood because it's taken out of cultural context. But I actually do think that if you want to look at it at a very base level, the kind of pushback that Lil Nas X is getting from the Black community, from other rappers, right?
Yeah.
I mean, transphobia, homophobia is still like like to be a man in the Black community, that being on top of a hierarchy and kind of expelling sexual difference is still a part of it. There's been a lot of change since I was a kid, but in my view, not enough. But it's definitely, I would say that the political lines aren't as clear per se, which is why, like, outside of the Midwest, during the protests and the riots, a lot of the people breaking shit weren't Black people. Was it St. Louis? I feel like police are always acting crazy in St. Louis, but it might have been St. Louis. It might be another town in Missouri. It wasn't Ferguson. Fuck me. Anyway, wherever the kind of outpouring of anger broke out, the people burning shit there were actually the residents of the town because they had actual grievance. But as far as like the countrywide protests, it was kind of a color coalition. But that's kind of like all leftist movements have this element of kind of piecing together different social movements in an ad hoc fashion in a way that might not make sense, to kind of push forward some agreed upon or not agreed upon agenda. Just to clarify my position, just so that I'm not defending things that I don't agree with. I tend to approach these things both from a historical perspective and also as a transhumanist. And so, as a transhumanist, I'm committed to a certain project of increasing liberty and capability of the human species. So that's what I'm focused on. From the historical perspective, most of human history, as far as intergroup conflict, has been awful, and as far as hierarchy within societies has been pretty rough for people, unless you are noble who's been landed for like 900 years or whatever. But even then, right? Like someone might jack your shit and like kill your family. And so
being noble wasn't that great, honestly. People don't, right? Like if you look back and you look at like names, right? You can see that people who are in the noble class, their names went extinct at a much higher rate than people who are in the upper classes of the mercantile class, because playing politics and warfare gets you killed a lot more.
Yes. And so just jumping off of that point, you see ways in which proto-capitalism existed in the Middle Ages, in the Hanseatic League, in Venice, in Pisa, in Genoa, and that kind of led up to the Dutch and the Portuguese and the different colonial experiments after after the 30 Years' War. So in my view, I don't view the society we live in now as the final template. So I'm not emotionally committed to the United States being the city on the hill kind of thing. That being said, I'm broadly pro-capitalism. And I think that I value social justice because it's willing to play with really crazy ideas, not necessarily that I value the ideas themselves, right? It's like so it's like I'm sure in the year 1200 there were a bunch of really weird ideas invented by monks on how to achieve more godly society. One of those ideas ended up being something that we kind of the thing we have now, this like weird mix of like kind of merchant powered democracy, right? But a lot of those ideas didn't come to fruition. Some of them might have been good and got crushed militarily. Maybe we can talk about whether that's a viable strategy to have an ethical idea that gets crushed. But yeah, so I'm not necessarily committed to the prescriptions of leftists, but I definitely view the frames as useful sometimes. So I guess maybe that's why I'm not as dogmatic as other people might be.
Yeah.
Right.
Because like I believe you completely, and I think this happens a lot, right? What I see is that you tend to defend leftist memes, right? So like as a person in social media, you tend to end up on the side of defending a left-wing meme, right? Or like just the fact that you seem to be very skeptical of the influence of Jordan Peterson in the parkour community. Mm-hmm. Like, tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I spent about a year consuming Jordan Peterson content. Mm-hmm. So I didn't read any of his books because I couldn't bring myself that far. But pretty much just like I subscribed to his channel, watched a ton of his videos, his university lectures, and so I probably should have prepared for this better.
It's okay.
There are few layers, right? Mm-hmm. So when you're as interested in particular parts of history in the way that I am, you kind of understand how different ancient cultures were. And so what's his name? Joseph Campbell, the kind of universal myth, that to me just doesn't seem like it acknowledges the way cultures invent things and the way cultures spread. So that was one of my big issues, is that Peterson seems very methodical and just completely misses that aspect of it. His view of so he'll defend capitalism in the same breath as defending cultural traditionalism, mm-hmm. which kind of brings me to exactly what I disagree with about social conservatives, is that capitalism is the engine that creates material change, which then affects social change, right? So, for example, the Taliban want to be included on the Belt and Road Initiative, right? They want to be folded into this system of trade in Central Asia, headed by China. And so what they're doing is they took a look at their PR campaign and all the crazy shit they did in the 90s, and they're like, all right, we need a better face, right? And so this is why Daesh in Khorasan, ISIS-K, is growing, because they're saying, look at these guys changing our cultural values to make peace with the Westerners in China, right? But they're doing it to be folded into this kind of capitalistic system. So there's this element in which capitalism forces cultural change. And so that's something that, like, I'm like, if it's interesting to me that he misses that. There's also an element to which, like, I'm bisexual. I have a lot of women in my life that are incredibly important. And so, like, some of the shit that he said about women, his the reason why he's famous is the what is it? Bill C-16, I think it's that. I mean, that whole thing to me just seems like needlessly, I don't know what the word is for it. Not even antagonistic. Like it seems to me that it seems a very strange thing to take a stand on. And then there's this element to which he will make claims, whether they're accurate or not, and then kind of have a cliffhanger where he won't actually say what these set of beliefs imply or what these set of beliefs should lead you to, right? So he'll oh fucking Christ. The big example that's sticking out is the conversation he had about lipstick in the workplace, but he actually was pushed to like prescribe something, but yeah, I need to actually like fish for an example. But you know, he pushes for concise speech and is actually like not concise at all. And so you walk away like not necessarily knowing not what was said, but what is being implied here. It's almost like someone communicating in code so that, you know, the secret police don't hear, you know, kind of thing. And so that's kind of the things that come to mind about Peterson. And there's all of this fluff only to bring you back to Christian conservatism, which seems very like, and so
I think that's very inaccurate, to be honest, right? Like
yeah, and we can talk about it because
I mean, so I heard a few things there. One is like there's elements of his speaking style that don't jive well with you, right? Which is fine, and I appreciate some of them. And he's a synthesizer, right? There's no grand synthesizers who don't get some things wrong.
Okay.
Right. Like that's just like anyone who's going to try to think, who's going to try to bring together things across a really broad range of disciplines is going to get some of them slightly wrong. And I have the same thing. Like I've studied lots of little subfields that he happens to stumble across. And occasionally he says something that's kind of ridiculous. Like he says that in one of his lectures that there was a cat that evolved specifically to prey on hominids, and it had a single tooth that was evolved to pierce the back of your skull. So first of all, no, there's no cat that specifically evolved to prey on hominids. Yes, big cats bit the back of human skulls, lots, evolutionarily. And he's conflating a Australian, the Thylaco leo with big tooth cats. Just like, oh my God.
Can we bookmark that, because that's actually really important. So that's another thing, is that he is a part of a recent tradition in which smart people in a domain specific field talk about shit that they don't fucking know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
So he will talk about the history of the 20th century and will pay attention to the broad strokes that you see in a textbook and miss the nuance. And in history, the nuance is really important. And so I'm approaching it from someone who loves history, who's been obsessed with history for, I mean, at this point, 25 years. And so when you are building prescriptive arguments off of faulty history, it just completely blows my mind. So here's an example. So he'll talk about he'll go on rants about Marxists, right? And about how our Marxists in North America are the same as Marxist-Leninists. So no, they're anarchists. Now you can criticize anarchism for what it is, and there are really good criticisms of anarchism, and there are a bunch of failed anarchist experiments that you can point at, but they're not the same as statist Marxist-Leninists, right? So you can say so.
That seems like a really big claim to me, and I don't think it's true. So I mean, like, who are you talking about specifically?
Yeah. I'm mostly.
There are definitely American Marxists who were Marxist, right? And there were a lot of American Marxists or American leftists who ignored the evidence of what was going on or carried water for the Stalinist regime.
Oh, for sure. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So like, I mean, Noam Chomsky is an anarcho-syndicalist, right?
Mm-hmm.
But he also basically, my understanding is that when Noam was young, he wasn't super critical of what was happening in Russia and was relatively blind to it. I'm not 100% sure about that. So I could be wrong about that, because he has been.
Yeah, I mean, there's this idea of like critical support, which is so critical support is basically like a country's internal politics might be rotten, but because they're not an imperialist country, like, you have to do everything you can to prevent them
Russia
from, like,
is not an imperialist country.
I've heard it in context of China, and like, weirdly
also
enough, like North Korea, which is really fucking weird. But at least North Korea. I don't want to defend. I don't want to defend.
So when you say that American Marxists aren't Marxists, they're anarchists.
So they're
like flatly wrong, because there are lots of American Marxists.
What I mean is that they're not Marxist-Leninists, which is.
I mean, I think they're obviously Marxist-Leninists in the American leftist tradition, right? I had professors in college who were Marxist-Leninists, right? Like, that's just not true. Right?
Yeah, I get what I'm saying is the bulk of American leftist talking points are either SOCDEM or anarchists. Now, I feel like the left anarchists, like, in the 20th century, I feel like I'm probably going to get people really upset at me for saying this, but left anarchism is good enough to, like, break a state so that either the fascists or the Marxist-Leninists crush you.
Yeah.
And this happened in Spain, this happened in Afghanistan, this happened in Ukraine. Like, left anarchism, like, morally makes sense to me, but it's only really good enough for, like, getting yourself killed.
Yeah. I'm not sure that I can follow that logic. I need more proof that the dominant stream of leftism is anarchism, because, like, who are the major important thinkers going back through leftist thought, specifically in America? Like, Noam Chomsky is obviously a huge one, and he is an anarcho-syndicalist.
Yeah, I need to be really careful with my speech. I guess I'm talking about our generation, and it's because the CCP has largely, like, they're still, like, writing theory, but they're basically, like, they're a capitalist country, right? They're state controls.
They're becoming less capitalist, right? They're moving away from capitalism. There's more and more state control. I mean, Jack Ma was just arrested, right? Mm-hmm. They're smashing down on their people. I can send you a really interesting essay about how Xi Jinping is pushing back all the sort of, even the slogans that were associated with Hu Jintao, and it was Deng. What was that?
Deng Xiaoping.
Deng Xiaoping. Yeah, like there's China is moving more authoritarian and more state controlled in its economy. Right.
Well, it's certainly authoritarian, but it's relying on capitalism to create.
It has
the wealth.
It has relied on capitalism over the last 30 years, but that's actually the liberalization of China economically is a story that it looks to me, and I could be wrong, but it looks to me like it's a story it's a trend that is in reversal rather than a trend that is continuing.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see. I think that the CCP is largely worried about social media companies, which is why they are like really coming down on. Yeah, I mean it's. I don't know enough to talk about social media and all of that stuff. Maybe it's some or social media in the context of like state propaganda and what people believe. And I should probably not talk about that. But basically, I don't view, like, in electoral politics, the American left is quite impotent. Like, if you were just paying attention to YouTube and Facebook and Twitter, you would have thought that Bernie would have cleared house, right? Like, there's no
not necessarily. I'm going to go back on that because
you
know, if you look at Twitter, there's a pretty vocal Bernie bro, right, group, but also there's a very vociferous anti-Bernie sort of modern social justice contingent. And that contingent is much more well represented in elite media, right? Bernie is not well loved by the New York Times and the Washington Post and the major sort of left-wing think pieces, right? There's this, you know, I have this.
The left. I think.
Go ahead.
Oh, I actually, I think we're probably definitionally having there's maybe a mismatch on who we consider right and left. And maybe that's the reason why we're not kind of landing.
Yeah. So like, I think left and right are really fuzzy terms, actually. I don't think that they're particularly descriptive. I think that they generally just that they're coalitions that seek power and that do not a completely random walk, but a relatively random walk through time where things move in and out of the coalition, right? When you have a first past the post voting system, you have this thing of like basically, essentially you're going to collapse into two parties. Now, theoretically, those parties might be completely random, right? Like, and you can look at lots of issues and see that they've completely flipped, right? So conservatism, right? Conservation, you know, that was first pushed by a Republican president. That was Teddy Roosevelt.
Okay. No. Yeah. Jesus.
You can obviously, you know, the Southern strategy was the grand flip on civil rights for African Americans, where Republicans went from the party of abolition to the party of you know, turning a blind eye to systems of racial oppression, basically. You like, even something that was crazy to me when I found out about it is abortion, right? Abortion was not something that evangelical Christians were against. It was something that Catholics were against, and Catholics were in the Democratic coalition up until I think it was sometime in the late 1970s, right? And that issue is completely, you know, it's one of the dominant issues of what left versus right means now, but it's only 50 years old, right? In that configuration. But I do think there is some central aspect to it. I think that the main thing is that the left tends to be more collectivist, right? And the right more individualist. That's something that you can track back to, you know, the French Revolution. But the way that I like to think about it, and I think it's really important because I think that people get really confused in this country right now by the idea that the left is liberal. And my perspective is that actually there's nothing inherently liberal about leftism, right? And we can see that in China, we can see that in Russia. There's nothing inherently liberal about rightism either, right? We can see that in the Nazis and Mussolini and fascism. But I believe that it was true that in the 1990s and the 1980s, that a lot of liberal political movements happened to be aligned with the left. So gay marriage, legalization of marijuana, these were things that are clearly removing the state's restrictions on individuals, right? Which is essentially a liberal thing. I think now something like CCP, that's clearly being against, or not CCP, C16, that's clearly a liberal issue, state compelled speech. Jordan Peterson is just fighting for a traditional liberal position, but now he's fighting against the left to fight for liberalism. And largely, a lot of the people, the IDW in general is best conceptualized as liberals who've been booted out of the left-wing coalition. There's people like Ben Shapiro, but most of the people, Eric Weinstein, the Weinstein brothers, Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, they're all left liberals, or were left liberals. Maybe Peterson was a centrist liberal coming into the current political not re-engineering, but reconfiguration, reorientation. But they've been booted out. Now, what's happening to a lot of people, and this is something that you might be picking up on and like being worried about the influence of someone like Peterson, is that when people realize how illiberal the left is becoming, they tend to flee into the right, right? And so there's this illusion, I think, that people who leave the left have, that the right is actually committed to liberalism at some level, in a broader and more general way than the right is, or in the left is. I think that's false. I think that actually, if you look at the data, you see that illiberalism is growing on the extremes of both parties. That younger people, whether they are aligned with the left or the right, are more in favor of authoritarian governmental structures and limitation and cancel culture, right? Lots of people on the left like to point out that cancel culture sort of starts on the right, right? That if you go back to the 90s and the moral majority, there's lots of cancel culture coming out from the right. And I think that's true. And I think there's still lots of people on the right who would love to have the whip hand of cancel culture and would happily use it if they had it. They just don't have the media control. So there's a space of people who are left to right, who are centrist, right? Who not even centrist. They're just, I would say that someone like Brett Weinstein is an extremist on the left, right? He's a very collectivist, statist oriented, progressive. He's just not aligned with the current progressive agenda. And because he doesn't have the liberty to speak in that, he's now aligned with liberals and in this sort of centrist middle ground. So I think it's really important for us to become much more precise in the way that we think about it, right? From my perspective, you have liberal versus authoritarian. That's one axis. Mm-hmm. You have economic economic liberalism versus collectivism, right? That's a different axis. And then you have something like traditionalism versus progressivism, right? And that's a different axis. And I actually think that my personal belief is that ideological adherence to any of these is wrong. And this is something that I'm deeply influenced by Peterson on, which I think it's very strange to me that people don't get his message, because I think he's really transparent about the fact that he thinks that conservatives are right some of the times and liberals are right some of the time. And we never know who's right, or one side's right some of the time, the other side's right some of the time. We never know exactly who's right until the future plays out, right? We're always just trying to find that balance between them. So, and sorry, I'm ranting, but let me finish this thought.
Yeah.
Essentially, a traditionalist or conservative perspective is just that human nature contains a lot of potential for chaos, and traditions are time-tested tools that organize human behavior in ways that tend to work well for us. And a progressive is someone who says, the system we have now is insufficient and is tyrannically oppressing certain people. And I think both of those things are always true, right? And a liberal is somebody who says, I want the government not to interfere with my actions as much as possible. An authoritarian is someone who says, yeah, but there are always places in which your individual liberty can start impacting other people, and we need to have the state have some power to negotiate that, right? And both those perspectives also always true. And a fiscal conservative or a fiscal liberal in a traditional liberal sense, right? Not a fiscal leftist, but a liberal is someone who believes that the less the government gets involved in markets, the more efficiently markets behave, which tends to rise all boats. And a fiscal authoritarian is someone who believes that market forces can easily get out of control and empower people to behave in ways that are against the common good. And again, I think those things are both true, right?
Yes, but the specifics really, really, really matter.
Sure.
And that's where I begin to kind of slant more towards one side. So I would
agree. And I slant the other way, but let's negotiate it.
You know, it's funny because I would probably say I'm not even pro. I'm very committed to my pet project instead of a particular idea of how markets should work or how economies should work, how political systems should work. But I think axiomatically, I disagree with conservatives because transhumanism is like the weirdest, like craziest offshoot of like change that you could possibly go with, which is so different from what a conservative is advocating for, right? These lie very diametrically opposed on whatever graph that you want to construct. So I suppose that it's, you know, I'm very humble in the face of like questions about these other things. I try not to talk about them because I don't know anything about the economy. I don't know anything about political systems. It'd be great if I could have more power, but I don't know what these things mean. What I do know is that there's certain social things that I take a stand on, and otherwise I don't know. And I'm committed. I focus a lot on the role that things like technology plays in altering what it means to be human. And yeah, I mean, I think what I'm trying to avoid is that there's so many people online that because they have a good camera and a mic, start talking about things that just they don't know about. And so I guess if it seems like I'm avoidant, it's truly because like I'm talking out of my depth. And when it comes to you know, how we should organize the economy, or even something like climate change, right? I have my own biases. We should do nuclear. We should put more money into fusion. But there are, you know, I did a summer internship with series in like computational like analysis of El Nino cycles. And that shit is really complicated. It's incredibly complex, right? And so it's like, you know, I see some futurists saying we should do solar shading, and it's like, okay, if you dropped the surface sea temperature across the Pacific by 30%, we don't have the mathematics that can describe what would happen, right? And so there's a lot of things I'm not ideologically fixed on because I don't have the tools to analyze it. And so I suppose in general, my stance is anti-conservative because my project is anti-conservative, just not specifically Christian conservatism, but like kind of a more radical change. But I'm not married to any specific idea on the left. I think where we disagree is that because groups like Antifa and Black Bloc don't have any political power, and because America is so staunchly capitalist, I'm not afraid of them. Like, I don't see them as being they're not people that,
I disagree.
and again,
they don't have political power, right? Political power comes at the end of a gun, right? So if you're allowed to run around and push people around, then that's a form of political power. And you can look at like Andy No, he's documented how the people who are protesting in Portland and destroying that city and assaulting people are regularly just getting off. They don't get convicted of crimes for what they're doing, even though they're tried for them and the evidence is there. There's a lot of political, I think there's a lot of ideological support for Antifa that's dangerous. And it's part of a general ideological capture of our elite institutions by people with left-wing agendas, which is very scary. And one of the things
I do want to say that because of the particular phenotype I was spawned in, I have clear biases to. I've never been threatened by anyone wearing Black Bloc stuff.
Yeah.
I have been threatened by, people flying Confederate flags.
Mm-hmm.
In, like Pennsylvania. Actually, here in Boulder, I don't think these guys were from Boulder. I think they were passing through. But I got accosted on the street with my kid by like people flying a Trump thing. And that's not saying like one group is doing it more than the other. I'm saying that my particular phenotype exposes me to a different aspect of reality.
You discover something interesting though, which is that if you changed your politics, your phenotype would expose you to attacks from the other side just as much, right? Like look at what happens to outspoken conservatives of color, and watch the white Antifa people yelling racist pig at black cops, right? Mm-hmm. There's a surprising amount of racism and sexism and even homophobia which is given a blind eye on the left, so long as it's aimed at people on the right.
What do you mean?
So for instance, like it's very popular on, in left-wing circles that I've seen, like online, to accuse white male conservatives of being cocksuckers, right? Which if the opposite way, the accusation would be that's homophobia, right? Or if someone like Candace Owens, who I think is a total shill, but nonetheless, if she speaks her perspective, people will say exactly the type of terrible things about her race, right? About her appearance, about her gender, that would be considered utterly unacceptable if she was within the tribe.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to touch this because
the counter protest against Antifa, people will call you, will use racial slurs against you. That's quite possible.
Yeah, I don't want to touch this because I'm not on Twitter, because Twitter is awful. But like, yeah, I don't know how to handle this one because I don't know how to prove or disprove any of it.
Right? Yeah, fair enough. I mean, I can't say for certain that the amount of racism is equivalent on both sides, right? And I certainly have my own biases, right? Like I am exposed to specific sets of information. I try to, I live within a extremely left-wing social milieu and always have, right? And I was fully committed to the left until 2008, right? I voted for Obama. We won. I celebrated like we'd won the Super Bowl in the streets of Bellingham. And then I flipped, and I went pretty far the opposite way. And now I would say that I'm I genuinely believe that I respect and understand the motivation between all the different political poles, and that I think that the solution always lies somewhere along the middle, that the extremes of all the ends end up being wrong. And I would say that currently I'm much more concerned about what's happening on the left. And I think I'd like to think part of that is an objective analysis, but I'm also aware that part of that is a reaction to my social milieu, that I would be much more concerned about QAnon and much more concerned about MAGA if I was living.
If you lived in Florida or something. Yeah.
I'm not exposed to the craziness of that side all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I get, Robin DiAngelo type stuff shoved down my kids' throats at school, not creationist stuff.
Right.
So of course that's what I'm going to be more concerned about. So I totally, I get where you're coming from with, like, obviously we carry our experience into our perspective. But when we come to, like, I think for me, it was really powerful. And it was through Peterson that I truly came to understand and respect, again, why the left was important and why there were insights there. And this is something that I think is so interesting that people don't get about Peterson, is that if you read him deeply, you can't be an ideologically committed to either side. You have to recognize that both sides are wrong most of the time.
So yeah, maybe it. And again, I'm coming at it from someone who's interested in the historical development of social and economic movements. I started in it being interested in military history, like most dudes. But so for me, it never seemed. It seemed quite obvious that, like, this is kind of how societies develop. You had these vested economic powers that put money into technologies, but then the money that they got was, like, partially through the transatlantic slave trade. It's like difficult to, like, decouple all of these things, right? Like, I'm the benefactor of, like, some pretty awful shit that happened in the past to my ancestors. It's
right.
Yeah, and it's all this, like, Gordian's knot of, like, weirdness, right? Or the fact that I'm an atheist, but it was Quakers that advocated for my ancestors' freedom. Like, fucking weird. So to me that seemed quite obvious, and maybe I missed it because I read it and was like, duh, right? So it's maybe it's just like people who have never kind of engaged with history.
Well, I mean, certainly, like, I think when you encounter intelligent conservatism, it's a lot more likely to move you towards conservatism. And when you encounter sophisticated, intelligent Christianity, it's a lot more likely to move you towards Christianity. And if you're just against that, then anybody who is doing that is going to be potentially threatening, right? But
well, I don't know. I listen a lot to, like, guys like Peter Thiel, said, very weird, like, transhumanist and Catholic, like, and obviously, like, very wealthy and was, like, on the pro-Trump situation,
and
but
is gay.
And yeah, like, total like weird, like, yeah, I mean, I guess my qualms with Peterson is that he doesn't feel. I almost feel like if I want there to be a bad guy in my story, I want them to be, like, worthy. I want them to be like Peter Thiel, like, feels like someone that I can be afraid of. He's got the, like, he's, like, really intelligent. He, like, knows theology. Good bad guy. Like, brilliant human being.
Central casting for sure.
Yeah. Whereas like Peterson, I'm like, I need more from you. Like, I need you to like just do more, please. Like,
maybe he's not the bad guy. Right?
No, it's a joke, but like
Yeah.
I kind of like to the extent that he has ideas, I feel like they need to be clearly communicated, and I feel like there's a lot of prescriptive statements that he makes. Again, like you were talking about the cat that evolved to like bite through human skulls, right?
That's not prescriptive. That's descriptive. That's a
Or
fault.
that's descriptive that leads to prescribing something, right?
You know, he said a lot of shit, and I've listened to most of it. Like, and there's only a few things that he says that are really dumb like that. And the thing that's really astonishing to me about him is that, I mean, he's a clinical psychologist who studies personality psychology. And when you listen to him in his area, he's authoritative, right? He's highly cited. But I'm deeply invested in evolutionary biology. And I think he offers insights there that you don't get a lot of other places. And his description of the mythological worldview, his essentially updating of Jung, is quite compelling to me. I'm not as deep in that area, but I've got some depth, right? Or, you know, my area of interest is like my strongest subject matter expertise is obviously movement, right? Motor control, like how do we teach people movement? Peterson's the person who introduced me to J.J. Gibson. J.J. Gibson is essentially the founder of ecological psychology, and the most profound stuff that's happening in the understanding of how we control movement is essentially the combination of J.J. Gibson and Nikolai Bernstein. And if you listen to Peterson describe Gibson's insights, it's one of the most profound descriptions of that you'll find, right? So he's one of those people who have the ability to donate well to a really broad range of conversations. That means, yeah, he makes mistakes, but I'm, you know, I don't think people get how brilliant it is. And I think that's part of why he's so tangential, right?
Yeah. And so
he's trying, and this happens to me too. Like, I feel like this happens to me a little bit too. I'm trying to take ecological psychology, right? Depth psychology, evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology, motor control theory, parkour, martial arts, you know, cognitive science, and like congeal something that solves this problem. And I'm not maybe exactly sure even what the problem that I'm aimed at is, right? And so as I try to describe that, I'm gonna be bouncing between these ideas. And sometimes I even feel it. It's like I'm trying to create a stream. I'm trying to create a river of thought, and it's still a cloud, right? And I can see that in Peterson. And I'm not saying the guy is perfect or that he doesn't have faults. But yeah, I mean, he's impacted my worldview more than anything else. And I think that when people critique him, I just don't hear very good critiques, right?
So there's a shift that I've had in the way I consume online media that's happened probably in the last 4 years, and I've actually started to look for more domain experts. So I acknowledge that multidisciplinary areas of like physics or psychology or something is really important because that's where all the cool stuff is. But if you're coming at it without having any domain expertise, just as a consumer, as someone on the internet, it's very easy to have someone speak well and be fooled.
Right? Oh yeah.
And so, for example, like I said, I don't know anything about the economy. So I try not to talk about it because I don't know anything about the economy. To the extent that I consume things about the economy, I like try to actually like engage with literature first, and then maybe later I'll consume something that disproves it, right? But you know, when I hear things about military history or like social history in the 20th century that's just either off or not taking into account the other things that were happening at the time, that to me is a red flag. And so it's like okay, so this happens a lot in with engineers in biology, right? So engineering is like notoriously difficult, whether it's mechanical, electrical, computer engineering. Electrical engineering is probably the hardest, but these folks come out of these programs, maybe even if they get a PhD, and they attempt to apply their knowledge to biology.
Yeah.
Now, so these people they're brilliant in their areas of expertise, right? So they've gone from these general engineering principles and slowly gotten really good at, say, like chaotic dynamics in electrical systems, right? And they're brilliant at it. Maybe they have papers, they're well published, they have a professorship at whatever university, and then they try to apply their knowledge to something that's completely different. Now, that venture is valuable, right? Because we need more people trying. Yeah. But when they speak from a position of authority about systems that they're not very familiar with, that's when I begin to have an issue, right? Because you can say, hey, I'm a student in biology. I'm trying to apply these ideas of the way currents work with neurons, and maybe there's something there. Cool. Thank you. You're doing humanity a great service. But when you start to speak like from a position of authority without actually knowing it, that's where I start to have issues, because people who are coming in, engaging with your material, that can't tell heads from tails, they'll just take you at your word.
Yeah, I mean,
and Peterson says, be precise.
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
in your
But
speech.
that's the thing. I think that that's one of the things I like about Peterson, is that I think that of the big synthesizers, I think he's one of the best at expressing his level of confidence and his level of expertise in an area. He's not perfect at it. He does get overconfident. He does overstate his things, and he does speak too authoritatively. Vervaeke, I don't know if you've watched my conversations with Vervaeke, but John Vervaeke is a professor of cognitive science at he's the director of cognitive science at the University of Toronto. He was he's a peer of Peterson's, and they work together, and he would every year they basically have a vote for the most life-changing professor at the University of Toronto, and it was always either Vervaeke or Peterson, right, while they were there. So he has an amazing series of lectures called Awakening from a Meaning Crisis. So anyways, I reached out to him, and I've had him on my podcast really regularly, like 6 times or something. And, we communicate regularly. And I would say that he's extraordinarily humble and really, really good at kind of representing that, right? And he rarely oversteps, right, or is presumptuous. So he's better at that than Peterson is, right? Peterson is more presumptuous than Vervaeke is, but he's much less presumptuous than, in my opinion, Steven Pinker or Richard Dawkins or Nassim Taleb, and certainly someone like Reza Aslan or Richard Lewontin or Stephen Jay Gould, right?
That's why I don't listen to any of them.
but we, generally I wouldn't know where to start with depth psychology, right? And there are insights that happen at the intersections of things that are valuable and necessary. I don't love a lot of Steven Pinker's recent work, but I think The Blank Slate is a really important work, right? I think that you should take Taleb with a giant grain of salt, but I think that his books are going to expose more people to a bunch of really important concepts than they would ever find anywhere else, right?
Yeah.
And Pearson shows that same rule. A lot of times you need a synthesizer and someone who speaks well just to introduce you to an area, and then you can go deeper into it. So
so it's actually interesting that you're putting Taleb and Peterson in the same box, because I'd never thought about. I was thinking about him in the capacity of being a professor, actually, of like, you've developed this expertise, and you're you seem to be quite good at it. Because it almost seems like his personal beliefs and him as a psychologist are like somewhat different. Because as a psychologist, it seems like his advice is pretty fucking good. But anyway,
yeah, he's a great clinical psychologist.
But I hadn't thought about him as a synthesizer.
Yeah,
because I tend, it's interesting. I tend not to like synthesizers. Like there's his last name is Harari, I think, and he wrote
Harari. Yeah, I'm not a fan either.
Yeah. And I just like I tried to read his books and was just like, and again, it's because I've engaged with history.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's just like,
it's useful to recognize as someone who specializes in an area that most people aren't going to specialize in an area, right? And that there's lots of areas that you're not going to be able to dig deeply into. So where like the truth is that we're reliant on other people's knowledge for 99.99999% of our worldview, right? Like, so I know, that if you over cue somebody when you're describing a skill, that they'll tend to progress less, right? How do I know that? Well, partially I know that from personal experience, right? That's something that I can see play out. That's empirical for me. But somebody who listens to me, they only know that because I say that, right? They're relying on my empirical stuff. And then I'm relying on research that, I can't cite off the top of my head exactly what the study was. And I can't tell you how many subjects were in the study. I can't tell you what the statistical analysis or study design they used to make that finding, right? I can go back and find those things, and I can sort of continually refine my knowledge of it. But we have to have people who can synthesize fields, right? So that, and make them compelling, right?
Yeah.
So that people can actually have it. So you have to, there's a necessity for interlocutors in the translation of knowledge from specialists to general population. And then the question is, how well are they doing that role? Right.
Right.
And from my perspective, like as someone who has a lot of subject matter expertise in things that, say, Peterson is covering, I'm very happy with how he's playing that role compared to like, I have this idea that there's a statistical concept in sports, wins above replacement.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a really useful way to think about public figures, right? Don't compare them to the ideal, compare them to what the replacement would look like.
Yeah. Give me 1 second. I've consumed way too much water.
Okay. Let's unmute yourself again. So, yeah, let's shift course a little bit here. We want to talk about transhumanism. Right? So that's your big focus, and I mean it's a progressive idea, right? It's an idea that the current condition of humanity is somehow insufficient, and that we need to move forward. And it's something that I'm super deeply skeptical of.
Yeah, I mean, there are some right-wing interpretations of it, which, kind of get scary, but yeah. So sorry, I cut you off.
So what does transhumanism mean to you? Like, why is that your passion project?
Yeah, so I suppose it comes from this deep sense of fascination with the possible. All the things that could be, and then from a historical analysis side, there's being interested in all of the ways past inventions have radically changed what it means to be human. So my last book on this was called Birth of the Pill, which it's about the funding and invention.
Write this or read it?
Read it. Sorry. Yes. It's called Birth of the Pill. It's about the invention of the birth control pill, and the I think Peterson is one of the few people that actually talks about how different things were before the invention of the birth control pill and how different things are now, and what it's made possible for women to do with things like careers and putting off childbirth and stuff like that. So there's this historical component, looking back and seeing how much change has happened since kind of the project of civilization began. And then there's the personal element of I have like some pretty severe reactions to food. I've had lots of near misses with lung infections as a kid, so I was like in the hospital a lot, and just having this realization of like, I wouldn't have made it if I lived in anything beyond, past 1950. Like I probably would have just not made it. So the why I'm interested has kind of the social component of allowing for more liberation. We can talk about that because it seems like a more constructive project. Whereas it seems like operating simply in the social realm of trying to change things like laws and culture can get really messy. It makes people upset. If it goes really badly, people die. So that doesn't seem like a good investment to me. And it's just the sense of wonder and boredom with the way things are now.
Okay. Have you heard me talk about why I'm anti-transhumanist?
No, actually.
I mean, essentially, it's really just a reflection of the general argument for conservatism, right? And the general argument for conservatism is that, well, first of all, it's much easier to break things than it is to fix them, right? So when we introduce something, we're much more likely to move it in a direction that's wrong than in a direction that's right. So there's an essay I can send you called a Formal Argument for Conservatism. But basically it says, first of all, imagine that there's essentially, a functionally infinite set of potential arrangements of the human social world, right? Now, imagine that there's a relatively few optima within that, right? And three, that we're not very good at identifying what those optima are. Four, that things that have survived for a long time are signals of what might be optimal for us. All those are true, then it's always more dangerous to get rid of a traditional structure than to retain it.
I'd possibly argue point 3.
Sure.
And that's simply because there is the element of military, right? So, for example, you could there were many more egalitarian structures that were, say, wiped out by the Romans, the Roman Republic. Carthage was kind of this like proto-capitalist oligarchy system,
where they sacrifice children regularly.
I mean, that was kind of a feature of like everyone during the Iron Age.
Yeah, but not the Romans. I mean, they had the circuses, but they weren't doing human sacrifice.
What about the Vestal Virgins?
I don't believe that was a thing that the Romans did, but I mean.
So it wasn't a regular thing. It was a thing when Rome was in trouble or during times of war. There were virgins, priestesses that would be sacrificed because that's like the ultimate thing. But
Carthage was brutal. Is my point.
I'm not saying that. So graded on the curve of the time that they lived in. So, for example, the Republic of I think the Republic of Novgorod was the one that survived. So it might have been the Duchy of Moscow, huh?
Okay, I mean that we're moved far forward in history if we're talking about non-plurality.
Yeah, but basically what I'm saying is like the princely states that existed there were these dynamic, almost like trade empires. They were trying to experiment on like what version of Christianity they were going to take up.
Yeah.
And then the Mongols came and basically ruined the whole project.
Yeah.
And really started the thread of Russian authoritarianism. Right, was I personally put that on the Mongols, right? And so you can see moments in history where projects that we would value, if we were forced to live in that time, were wiped out by societies that had a stronger military, but kind of a society.
No, I mean, it's not an airtight argument, right? It's just it's a directional argument, right? That. And I think Joseph Henrich, who I don't know if he realizes he's making this argument, but I think he makes his argument incredibly well in his book, The Secret of Our Success. And The Secret of Our Success basically is about the idea that human beings are not highly successful because we're especially smart. We're highly successful because we're extremely good at absorbing and transmitting culture. So what culture allows us to do is essentially create a Darwinian space for the competition of ideas. And then we can install those ideas. And that's what makes us highly successful. And he gives lots of examples about this. Like if you take European explorers and you strand them in the Arctic, they can't figure out how to make igloos and they can't figure out how to harpoon seals, right? If you take European explorers and you strand them in Australia, even if they watch the natives, they can't replicate how they engage in subsistence there. It takes time for people to evolve these. He gives the example of taro, right? The taro is a poisonous root, right, that has become extremely important in the subsistence of multiple cultures. There's something like 64 steps that are used in the traditional processing, which are largely, they're viewed from a religious lens. They're not viewed from a pragmatic biological lens, right? And if you remove some of those steps, then you're going to start poisoning yourself, but it's not going to become obvious for a decade what you've done. So you have this system that evolved over a long time and is very fragile to rational change. And what seems rational is going to be very destructive over the long term. So if it's true that essentially what makes human beings run is these systems that we're largely blind to, then changing those systems willy-nilly is very dangerous. And this is this is a lot of what Evolve Move Play is actually about. The idea is that you have to recognize and understand human nature and then try to look back to the past to try to capture the wisdom traditions that have allowed people to flourish. Now, we have to evolve the capacity for evolvability, because the problem with traditions is that traditions are always they're always optimized for an environment that no longer exists. And this is the problem that we face. The pill completely changes everything, right? The car completely changes everything. Tinder has completely changed everything. But what I'm worried about is essentially, I think of culture as an interface between our biology and our technological and ecological and economic environments. Right? And over time, it evolves to sort of optimize that so our biology functions well and we have relatively high well-being. When the thing changes, then you need to create new solutions, right? But we're not that good at creating solutions to these problems. So what can happen is, as the speed of change increases, you're ending up essentially building on kludges, right? You have to create a fast, dirty solution. The example I like to give is like sickle cell anemia, right? You have a strong selective pressure coming to your environment. Malaria, biology spits up an accident, a mutation that happens to be useful, and then it's rapidly replicated across the genome, even though it's has a lot of pernicious side effects. And I think a lot of what we're doing culturally is the same type of thing, right? And so the speed of change is actually something that I think is directly contrary to human well-being. So trying to increase the speed of change is, to me, the wrong place to invest. I think the project of trying to move to other planets is really, I'm not against it. I just think that it doesn't solve any of the important problems of human existence, because I think that human beings are much more deeply attuned to being earthlings than we realize, and that you can't remove a human being from the context of the earth and put them in some other completely different ecology, down to the type of the spectrum of light that they're absorbing, the cycle of the day, the gravity that they're experiencing. I don't think a human being, as a human being, can survive on another planet. I think that in order for human beings to colonize other planets, we will have to engineer ourselves into something that would be completely alien to us.
And this is why I'm a transhumanist. So when I was a kid, I was really interested in exploring the solar system and seeing what was there. But it was the realization that these environments are so different, and that we are really not evolved for it. Mm-hmm. That helped push me along to these ideas. And so there's a couple of things. One, I'm not going to trivialize how difficult these projects of like changing humanity are. I think in the case of something like space exploration, I think what it does is it increases humanity's, or whatever branch of hominid, surface area to explore new economic, social, cultural ways of being. Especially if you're not living on Earth, your culture is going to be quite different. And so maybe we haven't achieved an optima, right? Which is why I spoke about military expansion, right? Because if you live, let's say you live on a moon of Jupiter, if someone on Earth believes that your culture is abhorrent, it's going to take quite a bit of oomph to get people over there to like beat you up and convert you to whatever, right? Whereas Earth is we're the most ideologically and religiously homogenous we've ever been. There's no certain ideas have kind of grown into their limit to the point where the only option is to push into each other. And it's I don't know what it will take for us to deal with that. So that's one point. The other is human well-being is kind of a flexible. We both of us have a different concept of human well-being. So to me, the speed of change is actually good because it's too fast to legislate. It's too fast to have a culture or an aspect of the culture come down on it, right? If people of the time voted on the birth control pill, it wouldn't have happened, right? It took a bunch of chemists to do it in a really janky and kind of unethical way with the experiments in Puerto Rico, to just put this thing into the world and say, here it is. And I think one area where most of the left kind of misses the plot is that they don't talk about the transformative element of technology, right? So
I think that there's a good case that the birth control pill has largely been negative, particularly for, say, the African American community, right? Because you've destabilized, potentially you could make an argument, and I won't say this argument is definitive, but we've changed the entire incentive structure of the mating market, and that's destabilized family formation, which has resulted in the largest numbers of broken families that have ever existed in our society, in particular in the African American community. And we see that there's a huge correlation between any number of social pathologies and broken families, right? So
is that on the birth control pill though? Like that don't we would have to.
I'm
I'm
not
sure
saying
there's
that it
some
is.
study that.
I'm saying that
Okay.
it's certainly that it's certainly a reasonable, it's a plausible, it's a plausible incentive in the system that changed people's behavior in a direction that resulted potentially in a massively lower net well-being, all else being equal. I'm not saying that this is the facts, right?
Okay.
I'm just saying that you point at something like that as if it's necessarily an unalloyed good, and I can see an argument that in fact it's destabilized our culture in ways that have been far more damaging than people realize.
Well, I mean, I suppose it would have to be established as like a sociological fact for me to. But that being said, people who have more freedom are going to do crazy shit. Like in the United States, you can buy everything short of a bazooka or like a Stinger missile.
Yeah.
And that means that there's going to be some subset of the population that chooses to use that on their neighbors, right? That's just a thing that, like, obviously it's a debate, but so far,
the bigger problem with guns is people using it on themselves.
Yes, yeah.
Right. Suicide
is way bigger.
3 or 4 times as common cause of death is murder.
Yeah. So, but as a society, we've kind of just folded that into what we accept as everyday. I mean, even with cars, right? Like we just accept traffic deaths, right? And that's just a part of American life. And where most cities in America are based around this thing that takes, I don't know the number, but it's quite high. It kills a lot of people every year. So, like, would some of the things that I'm interested in increase alienation? Yeah, probably. Like, would it alienate young men who want traditional families? Probably. And that part I don't quite know how to deal with, because it seems like if that's what you want, especially in this society with the internet, you can find someone to meet that need. You're not gonna like.
Well, no, I mean, that's I like, people are failing at that. Like that's like the average woman would like to have 2 to 3 children, and the average woman is having 1.7 children, and if she has a graduate degree, then she has less than 1 child per individual woman. So the expressed desires of the population are not being met, right? If you look at something like Tinder, the average woman matches with 4% of her potential males that she sees on the app. The average male matches with 60% of the potential females that he sees on the app. So there's this massive insensitive structure that's changing the way that men and women behave in ways that are probably not healthy or good for them, right? Something like men between the ages of 18 and 30, the number of men who have not had sex in the last year between the ages of 18 and 30 has doubled in the last decade, I believe, between 2008 and 2018. So the system is shifting in a direction that is making it harder for the average person to satisfy their needs, right? So women are maybe able to find sexual partners, but because a relatively small group of men are the ones who are being selected by women, they are generally opting out of partnership, right? So you have some men who are doing really well in short-term mating, some women who are enjoying short-term mating with those men, but not getting the long-term mating that they desire, and a lot of men who are locked out of the market completely.
Yeah, this is a conversation I was not prepared to have.
Yeah.
For several reasons. One, because every person that I've dated, I've met online through a dating app. But I've kind of circled around these discussions and tend not to pay attention to them. So I actually don't know anything about specifically the effect of men, the effect on men of this stuff.
But if you
and I feel like anything that I would say is just like,
so you have the sense that there's a crisis of masculinity or of men, I suppose, in the parkour community that you're picking up on. This is quite possibly the type of thing that is moving a lot more men towards depression. And we see that depression and anxiety and suicide are all rapidly rising, right? And it's actually more in women, especially young women, but men always commit suicide more frequently than women. So,
well, so I think one thing that is clear to me is that there is a disconnect in the way the modern world works versus what we're wired for. Exactly. So, for example, let's say that both of us want to get into a fight, right? Yeah. We're probably going to do fists, kicks, knees. We might grapple. If it's really bad, we might grab weapons. Modern combat between nations happens at ranges that are inconceivable to the human.
Drones and missiles,
and even a firefight, right? If the both of us are shooting at each other, if you were across the street, you'd be considered close, right? Oh, yeah. That's considered close combat, right? This was actually something that kind of gave Europe collective existential dread during the First World War, is that warfare had been completely disconnected from masculinity. There was no courage, right? The courage was in holding the position while you get shelled to the, while your position gets turned into the fucking moon, right? Like there wasn't the concept of like the shield wall or charging on cavalry or like any of that stuff. And some of that, was brought over to the pike and shot era, where like people were slowly transitioning to muskets. But this seems to me like a wider, like, it seems like every aspect of what we were wired for as we progress into the future becomes more abstract and alienating, right? And so there's, like oftentimes there's this aspect of the science fiction and futurist community that brings in real physics concepts into writing science fiction literature. And so kind of an outgrowth of this would be like the Expanse books.
Sure, yeah, love those.
Right. And so in the Expanse, the way the authors have people actually fighting in person, it's all like very circumstantial. Most of the actual combat between nations are happening at like hundreds of thousands of miles in between ships, right? Literally, people are like sitting at computers, right? And like drinking coffee as if it's like they're at an office, right? And the stakes are like the structure that is maintaining human life is going to either vaporize or not, right? It's so different from the way humans evolved to fight other animals and each other, right?
And this is precisely why I'm why I'm against transhumanism, because what you're talking about is accelerating a trend towards alienation when we haven't solved the problem, right? So so obviously there are certain things about technology and capitalism that have been really great, right? Like, never have we lived in a world where more people have abundance of food, clean water, shelter, electricity, right? Antibiotics, right? Like just in the last like 40 years, something, China has been turned into a middle class nation, right? Whatever you want to say about the CCP, and I'm deeply, deeply concerned about the role of the CCP in the world. The fact that hundreds of millions of Chinese people are no longer starving has to be seen as a global good, right? Mm-hmm. That said, I have this sense that at least in the West, the role of technology in improving human well-being has stalled in the 90s, and that most of what we have developed technologically since then has actually eroded human well-being. Facebook, Twitter, yeah. Instagram, smartphones, these things are actually making human beings more reactive, more dependent, less capable, and more emotionally miserable.
Okay, so I would say that I'm a really weird case because I was born in East New York, Brooklyn, mm-hmm. Which is like in the 90s, it was like one of the poorest and most dangerous parts of Brooklyn. Moved around a lot as a kid. Was homeless at some point with my family. And one of the interesting things is that the internet, actually video games taught me how to read, and the internet taught me how to speak in the like standard American vernacular, yeah. Which has opened up so many doors for me. Just like my cultural affect. Mm-hmm. And that's all YouTube. Literally just like watching YouTubers and copying them. And obviously that's like a whole other thing of like, that's a whole other can of worms that different sociologists would find really interesting. I mean, regardless, kind of my the internet can be alienating, but it was through the internet that I was able to find even parkour, right?
No, I have a similar story. Yeah. Right? Like I grew up in a redneck town, right? In a hippie community. So I'm not a real big fan of hippies. I don't culturally meld well with rednecks. So I was very socially isolated. I was very socially retarded in my teens, right? Because I just wasn't exposed to people who I found interesting to communicate with, right? And so I really started developing social skills through Tolkien forums online.
Oh, whoa. Okay.
In the first communities of friends that I found as a young adult were through, the onering.net and things like mm-hmm. that. And then, music forums as well. And then parkour, right. And, that was a huge thing. And then I've traveled the world professionally, basically through contacts that were made through those forums, through the internet, and then Facebook, right? Like my entire career and the discipline that I'm devoted to owes its widespread nature to the internet. So obviously these things are things that have powerful benefits. It's just a matter of the cost versus the benefits. And when I look at a society-wide analysis, even though I can look at my own life and say, okay, this has been great for me. I think a society-wide analysis indicates to me that the role of particularly, I think, social media and the smartphone have been extremely pernicious in their impact on human beings.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not going to sit here and defend social media companies. I'm of the opinion that we need to. Here's actually one of the areas I agree with Peter Thiel on is like we need to get back to physical technology.
Yeah.
Like in 0 to 1, his latest book, he really advocates for like, the companies like Neuralink or companies like SpaceX or companies like I don't know, companies that are doing physical things in the world that actually are good for us instead of like I have a pretty dim view of apps. Like I feel like it's one of the areas of capitalism that can become very rent seeking.
Mm-hmm.
You know, things like Airbnb, as much as I love Airbnb, Lyft, as much as I love Lyft, it's just like there's actually the innovation is such that they can cannibalize existing business structures like hotels or cabs, mm-hmm. without actually like adding something new into the world that is like, I don't know, that is like physical. I was going to pick this up, but this is a phone. But like, you know, like, yeah, I have a deep respect for, my goodness, the camera is like not handling, not handling the sun well. You know, for material scientists and people like in chip design and mechanical engineers and stuff like that. And so that's kind of what I think about when I talk about accelerating technology. I think we need to get out of this, like, this whirlpool that we're in, because it's in my view, it's almost like the financialization of the market, where you're just like moving around capital to do things in the world that actually aren't that different. Like one argument that really gelled with me, that Thiel makes, is if you look at the interior of a house or an office in the 80s, like other than like aesthetics, how different is it really from a house in 2020? Mm-hmm. Like, infrastructure hasn't changed. You don't really have like a Jetson style AI helper. Like it's really, the technologies we've pushed forward are important, but there's too much capital focus on it. And again, I'm not an economist, so I don't necessarily know. Actually, okay, here's one thing I've heard from economists. The reason why there's so much capital allotment to social media companies is because you're not creating anything physical. So there's no investment into labs, factories, that kind of thing. And then if you're just paying software engineers, yeah, their salaries are like almost $200,000, but you only have 50 of them in your startup, right? As compared to like having an army of people both inventing and manufacturing and distributing a physical product. So for someone limited, for someone who's investing, it's a really good investment.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard Eric Weinstein and Peter Thiel talk about this, and about, you know, essentially the great stagnation and how we need to move out of it. But I fundamentally I think the Thiel Weinstein perspective is something like we're misallocating our talent. It's largely going into financialization in digital spaces, and you know, that's just not going to create the widespread abundance and affluence that the sort of more physical technological revolutions of the early 20th century did, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, I respect that argument, but I also am still leery of new technology as just a general thing, because I think that the speed of change has resulted in us having a very poor culture to technological match right now, and that's actually the bigger problem that human beings face. And I think, you know, Weinstein, to me, a lot of transhumanism just feels like well, actually, more and more I see things through a Christian symbolic lens, right? The idea is basically like Weinstein wants there to be a transcendent goal for humankind. And that transcendent goal is getting our species out into space, right? But I don't think that actually achieves anything that is important to individual human beings, right? It expands the amount of hominid-like things out there, but those things that once they're on other planets are going to be unrecognizable to us. We're essentially just going to see the world with alien life forms. And, like you mentioned The Expanse. I think The Expanse does a really great job of pointing out that all the horrible dynamics of human nature can play out in space just as well, right? And we can toss rocks at each other. We've become gods, but for the wisdom. So becoming more godlike without developing any more wisdom just seems like a bad mistake to me. So I think that the place that I want talent allocated is in learning what human beings are really like, what they respond well to, and how to maximize their well-being. And fundamentally, I think that, when transhumanists point to the ability to sort of manipulate your biology in any way, or the ability to get off this planet, they're essentially describing a kind of teleology that is a movement towards the kingdom of heaven.
I mean, I tend to really disagree with singularitarians.
Yeah.
Because they're the way they frame the singularity, whatever the fuck that is very rapturous. Mm-hmm. Like once AI can do this, then we'll be. And I grew up in a Pentecostal tradition, so I kind of recognize it for what it is. And to me, it's not necessarily. I don't. The way I view transhumanism is that there are layers of difficulty in the natural world, and we don't know how high this thing goes. But in the same way that like you can't teach, like in the same way you cannot teach your dog calculus, right? There's only there's a ceiling to like what a dog self-actualizing and pushing its limit as like a pack and an individual means. There's a ceiling because we're biological creatures to what we can do. Mm-hmm. And so if we mess with because the single unit of a society is the individual, right? And so we can tweak things at the level of the society with laws and culture and stuff like that. But if humans say we're the sort of species that could like survive in a vacuum, climate change would still suck for all the other animals. But like for us, we'd be like, well, I mean, we can survive on the moon and Europa and like Ganymede, so like it doesn't matter.
See, I think there's an illusion there. You think of the thing that we create that survives in the vacuum as us, and I don't think that that's us.
Well, and I guess, and here's where it connects with,
right?
Here's where it connects with why I'm somewhat sympathetic, or why I'm sympathetic to kind of cultural left affectations. It's because I think humans, sentient life, whatever, we really need to get better at dealing with difference, right? So you believe differently from me. Mm-hmm. I'm of a different sexual orientation, different ethnic group than you. I have friends that are trans, whatever. We have to figure out how to get on, because as time progresses, we will become more different.
Yeah.
And if we can't deal with someone switching from male to female or female to male, we're not going to be able to handle people genetically engineering themselves, implanting devices, that kind of thing. And I actually really worry that our inability to deal with difference is going to spell trouble once the technologies really allow for people to augment themselves.
Have you read R. Scott Baker?
No.
Highly recommend. But you can read an essay, it's pretty quick, on his website called The Semantic Apocalypse. And his contention basically there is that once we have the technology to alter our minds, that we will diversify in such a way that we will become completely incomprehensible to ourselves, to each other, right? And we should be very worried about that, because essentially the thing that comes after that, we're just the scaffold for. And that's what's in that, whatever they see as in their interest isn't necessarily in our interest. And this is my fundamental thing. Like I'm a believer in the necessity for love, right? I think that's the best way to think about it, right? That to me is the Christian vision. The Christian vision is that I love, that I treat the world as everyone in the world as having the potential to contribute towards moving us closer to the kingdom of heaven, right? And I don't mean this in a metaphysical way, right? That's symbolically, I think, the most powerful orientation for a human being to adopt. So I can treat someone who's bisexual or transsexual or anything else with love. And I think that's actually a better orientation than the orientation of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because what I see within the critical social justice community is actually an extreme intolerance of those who don't agree with their position, right? So, for instance, I think that a large percentage of people who are currently coming out as trans are affected by a social contagion, and that this is probably not in the interest of their well-being. I also think there's a substantial portion of people who are legitimately trans and do need to transition, and that's the best path for them. But I think the push towards an affirmation only approach to transsexuality has been a massively harmful thing. Now, there are a lot of people who will immediately attack me as a transphobe for saying that. And that's not a tolerant position. And what we're seeing is that even as we are pushing for a inclusion of a broader set of identities, we are becoming less and less tolerant of deviation from the orthodoxy of belief. That is what scares me.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, don't you have to see a psychologist to start transitioning?
So what's happened is that within psychology, there has been a push for an approach to treatment of transsexuality called affirmative only care. That is to say that whatever you tell me your gender is, I, as your psychologist, have to affirm you in that. So this is not based on any solid science. This has been, as far as I understand, pushed by activist communities. And there have been, important researchers like Ray Blanchard or Alice Dreger who have been driven out of their university positions because of speaking out against this. And there's a large and growing community of detransitioners who didn't get the support that they needed to recognize what was actually going on with them. What we've seen is that transsexuality has gone from something like 0.02% of the population to now over 2% of Generation Z declare themselves as transsexual. Almost all of them are girls, and it seems to be associated with the same social markers of social distress that we saw with anorexia, which was also socially contagious, and bulimia, and self-harming, cutting. All these things are associated with the growth of that community. So to me, it's actually not a loving thing to accept somebody's idea about who they are uncritically.
So I don't have the data. I'm not on solid ground to argue about this particular point because I don't have the data and I haven't engaged with the kind of psychological element of it. But it's because I have the position. So transhumanists, there's like the kind of like more left transhumanists, and then there's the like American libertarian transhumanists. But one thing we agree on is this idea of morphological freedom, which is to say, if you want to augment your body, it's like, this is your form to do with whatever you want to do with. And so, my response to people wanting to detransition is, why don't we have better technology to allow people to go back to the sex they were born as? Like, it seems like it would be kind of an obvious thing to do. And I'm sure someone's working on it somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Because basically what you want is for someone to be able to make that choice, decide it's not a good choice, and then go back, and then like all of the medical stuff is like whatever, because some doctor 50 years ago figured it out.
But we don't live in that world, right? We don't live.
But we can create that world in the same way we didn't live in a world where.
I don't think we can create that world, honestly. But, or I think, yeah, I'm not sure that we can create that world, at least not for a long time. We don't have the technology. Like, if you look at what gender transition looks like it's
pretty intense.
It's intense. It's not comparable, right? It is not like you're just like another person of the gender that you move to. I should say sex, but and
my underlying assumptions, I think, are
you
just
you can't take my bone structure and make it into a woman's.
Yeah. So that's one area where I'm not even. I don't know how I was prepared for.
Like, can you imagine what it would take to take my giant broad shoulders, right? Mm-hmm. Narrow hips and massive frame. Like, I'm 225 pounds, right?
How tall are you?
I'm 6'1".
Fuck. That's crazy. Okay. Yeah.
My hands, my wrists, the bone on my forehead, like, to make me passable as a woman, you would have to re-engineer me you'd have to just completely change this body, right?
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, so here's the thing. I'm not trivializing how I'm not trivializing how difficult these projects would be. Yeah. What I am saying is, like, I believe that people should do what they want with their and so this is the more transhumanist position.
You have to recognize, right?
Is I'm not necessarily affirming like their beliefs about themselves, but I'm coming from a transhumanist position of like,
do whatever you want with your body. But here's the thing. You have to give people real knowledge, and like, right now people are pushing for earlier and earlier transition of children, right? Something like puberty blockers. Everyone should be able to have access to puberty blockers, but puberty blockers result in long-term osteoporosis. You may never be able to orgasm. Your fertility is disrupted. Your IQ is 10 point lower at adulthood than if you didn't take puberty blockers for an extended period of time. Like, these things have real consequences, right? And girls are going in and getting mastectomies when they're 15 years old without parental permission. You can put a breast back in, but it's not a breast. You can't regrow the tissue that allows a woman to feed a child. You just put a piece of silicone in its place. Like, this is not the technology to truly be able to undo the terrible things that people are doing to their bodies isn't even close to existing.
But I think what you're listing out to me is a feature set of an incomplete project. In the same way that like 20 years ago, telling someone that you'd be able to re-land rocket boosters is like.
So I mean,
my frame.
Here's a body manipulation that has gone from very unsophisticated and damaging to legit. People can now get hair transplants that look completely natural and look great. And that was not true. And it only exists to some degree now because people went and tried it over and over again and it sucked. But the problem is that people are ideologically pretending like what we have now can actually achieve what they're trying to achieve. The problem with having this incomplete project set is that you're telling people that the project set actually achieves the end, and it doesn't.
All right, here's where I'm going to get in trouble. It's an incomplete project set.
Yeah.
Like I'm not. So there's this discussion in the trans community about passing.
Mm-hmm.
but it's because we're working with primitive technology, and fuck. God, people are going to be so mad at me, but it's because our methods are primitive, right? And so as far as like also augmenting someone with hormones instead of down at the genetic level is problematic, because like things aren't one for one in that way in the body. But
shut down your natural hypothalamus gonadal system, right? HPTA.
Yeah.
HPTG system. So,
so you know, as a transhumanist, I generally believe like you have to be of consenting age to augment your body in a way, especially if it's a more primitive technology. It will be harder to undo, that kind of thing. I've heard from psychologists that it's psychologically better for someone who's trans to have like that intervention early. I haven't thought about it.
Yeah,
so
I think that
I don't know. I don't know.
Established by the research, right?
I don't know what to make of that point.
70% of gender dysphoric children desist in their gender dysphoria if they reach adulthood, and they're not transitioned before they reach adulthood. And this is completely ignored by the trans activist community, right? So
is that where is that? Well, I guess, yeah. So what I want to argue, I want to argue from my axioms instead of being pulled into defending things that I don't really know about. So I mean, I guess this is why transhumanist philosophy is kind of boring, because it's very libertarian in that way of just like, and it's also, it has a technological focus. So I'm not going to argue with you about things like bone density or like kind of where the technology is at right now, because that's, I mean, it's clear that the changes aren't so like the discussions in the trans community about passing wouldn't exist if the technology was like spot on, right? I think we could, so in my view, we should push to, in the same way that we're pushing towards Mars or pushing towards like better solar panels, we should push towards a situation where someone can make that decision and have it not fuck up their life. And that's just, I think most transhumanists would agree with me there
Okay, guys, technical difficulties. So we tried to record the podcast. We forgot to, we tried to pause the podcast, forgot to unpause the podcast. We've been talking for quite a bit longer since then, so we don't know where the conversation ended, but we both have to move on with our day. So unfortunately, we're not going to be able to go back and finish the threads. So apologize for the conversation feeling a little bit sudden in its ending, but I know I really enjoyed it. I really appreciate the openness, Lucas, in coming on here and wanting to have a conversation across some pretty deep ideological lines. And I look forward to future conversations.
Yeah, I do as well. I'll be back when I'm better read about sociology.
Okay. Yeah. Is there anything you want people to know about you, or anywhere to find you, or just?
Oh, well, I think parting words. I think the range of possibilities is potentially bigger than we expect, and so I think that one of the ways to be optimistic about the future is to kind of tap into all of the cool things happening with technology. It's not to say place your entire faith in technology, but I think it's one of the ways to kind of get through the doom scrolling and all of the awful news on the internet. So yeah.
I love the term doom scrolling. Less doom scrolling. That's my advice.
Less doom scrolling, more solar punk and all that cool stuff.
Have a good day. Hey, you've reached the end of another Evolve, Move, Play podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, if you want to be involved in the conversation, please consider joining us in our new membership subscription so you can get access to question and answers with our live speakers once a month, question and answers with me once a month, and a dedicated forum to discuss everything going on in the podcast, as well as a general discussion of movement on our general movement forums. If you're interested in that, make sure to check out the link below, get signed up, and join a part of our membership community. If you can't join our membership community right now, it's still always helpful if you can like, share, and subscribe, and even hit that bell and get notifications for upcoming Evolve, Move, Play podcasts. But adios for now, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, guys.